I'll stand for this because Riva asked me to stand. Wait, let me just check. Can you hear me? Is the mic okay?
Yes. Also, forgot to say, but time yourself. I won't be sending timestamps in the chat.
Okay. Thank you, Francis. I'll take PYs through chat. You can also just raise your hand or turn on your camera. Both are fine. Just no verbal PYs. Okay. I'll start my speech in 3, 2. The formal credential model has historically been a means of expanding access and capacity for people. The master-apprentice models tend to things like nepotism, tend to things like abuse, and the loss of job mobility and agency by restricting workers to specific companies. This is a world we prefer, where people have access and people have choice. 3 points of setup. Firstly, what are non-academic fields? We describe them to be vocational trademark like types of jobs, people like repairmans, plumbers, or electric engineers. But secondly, what is actual credential modeling and what does it look like under our comparative? What this means is that the world specifically creates different counts of or ideas and standards for what accreditation is. It looks like specific curriculums, licensed teachers or working professionals being the ones to teach you, which is important because it does not mean that we turn all technical vocation into universities, but rather these things are given some form of standardization or accreditation, i.e. these things can still be 2 years, we can still have OGTs and on-the-job training. What this specifically explains is why we need to create more credentials and standards for these people working within these spaces. But secondly, this exists specifically still in academic fields. That is, there is a broad social perception that credentials do matter, and en masse is what we use traditionally in order to evaluate people and their capacities in the job market. This doesn't just disappear under our comparative. 3, what is the burden push we'd like to push on opposition? It cannot be both. There is no incentive otherwise to teach in technical vocation schools because these people can just rather informally take apprentices with more agency and freedom towards themselves. In fact, more capacity to do things like nepotism and more things to do like abuse. All these reasons explain it can't be both. First argument. Why is there more opt-in to these courses and schools? Why is access, I want to note firstly, more important? We'd explain that it lowers barriers to entry compared to university. That is, that these services have things like infinite demand. It's meeting demand that's important. Things like repairs, plumbing, electricity. That oftentimes is a barrier that education institutions need to meet, but also that people themselves need to be able to enter into at the point of which these things are easier. What is the mechanization for why people will opt into schools? Firstly, it's seen as safer since it uses traditional methods of teaching. That is, since schools already use these things, it's seen as less risky, i.e., that your job is more credentialed, it's more credible in comparison to everything in the market right now. Secondly, it's the ability for diverse individuals to enter. The problem with the master apprentice model is that it relies on heavy connections. You have to take in a few people at a time to really teach people at best possible. But what this does is shifts away from things like meritocracy, shifts away from things like credentials and the basis of what you've actually done historically, but rather into things like nepotism and the sheer connections that you've had in being able to even access a certain master to be able to teach you. The reason we're able to solve this is in 2 ways. I'll take you later. Firstly, it's that more people are just generally accepted into these institutions, i.e., there's more expansion towards these things. It's less based on things like nepotism and rather on meritocracy, where if you believe it's important in the developing world, oftentimes these people have opportunities that they would never have been able to access if it was only based on connections that always skew away from the marginalized individuals. But secondly, that the importance of expansion means taking in more people to wide access. That meant that schools had done things like expand scholarships. We've created online schools and networks to be able to allow for people to access different types of jobs or certification to somewhat embolden the credentials that they currently have. That meant that even schools right now have constantly trended towards even more accessibility and in fact made it easier for people to prop up things like credentials and access a variety of different jobs and companies. But 3, it's that more companies align themselves with credential models, and that means specifically diversity, i.e., the master themselves, I want to know, is likely tied to one singular corporation. And the reason for why is because you need to build tenure and connections within that in order to actually get people into these areas or get some sort of tenure or get some sort of reputation as a good master. The problem with this is that oftentimes companies either one, always get these individuals into them, i.e. nepotism, or they're able to bribe masters into taking them into these places. The problem is that it comparatively, this means that people have less job mobility, they have less access to diverse amounts of companies. Our side bases this on credentials, i.e. be able to apply more on scale to diverse sets of companies. You're able to do things like prop up your like diversity or prop up things like your curriculum or prop up things like your resume in order to be able to apply to a variety of different companies that are able to take you in as comparison to only one master and one company by effect. Second argument, why are people actually treated better? For I'll take PY.
So universities and credentials are often quite expensive in comparison to things like master apprenticeship versus a dominance of a master apprenticeship world that means more masters and lesser nepotism.
So the first question is because of standardization and the mass access that schools are able to give you. There are obvious competing incentives to make these things more accessible for people. But the second question is what is more expensive? Is it getting an education and propping yourself up? Or is it relying on connections and nepotism that clearly most marginalized people themselves have? There's still a trade-off on their comparative that more nepotism and more exclusivity from these people mean that it's harder for them themselves to get these jobs and get these types of work. 3 points of setup, 3 points of analysis for why people are treated better. Firstly, we have more benefits when you're able to access these things. Why? What we have is clear industry standard. You have professors who have good credentials. You have comparative wages you're able to measure against people. You have the ability to choose these things and choose what jobs offer better welfare. That means that you have better mobility across different states. With masters, the problem is that this restricted agency means often less negotiation power. What you do is less jobs you're able to access. What you do is more tendency towards abuse when these people are sure and certain you're going to enter that company and that you can't move out precisely because you don't have the necessary credentials in order to transfer into different jobs. Secondly, that you have a standard credential system that allows for better job mobility in terms of wages, i.e., the problem on their comparative is that it's difficult to transition to a variety of different companies. How do you explain to them that your master is someone that's good when they haven't been tenured in the company or worked with them for years? How do you explain to them the transferable skills that you have when credentials themselves aren't necessarily important in this world? What this leads to is sticky labor. It's hard to negotiate wages. It's hard to move away without a clear credential to rely on over years of tenure a master has in a company. 3, it's a social perception. The problem is that these jobs are seen as less. What people see now is that these jobs are more validated. And this marginally is importantly impactful because people feel proud and aren't shamed. These people work in these areas for 40 to 50 years of their life. That is a life otherwise led in shame. These people collectively feel more connected, which is often the impetus for things like labor unions and even things like joining rallies and whatnot. But 4, it's more likely that you're a skilled individual, i.e., because things like you are able to collate the curriculum from multiple experts. It's things like considering teachability. You can apply these things in real life, or even things like the curriculum and the standard of education changing now and then and being updated and set the standards, which in comparison to what happens in opposition, you are likely compared and stuck with apprentices stuck in one style, which often is bad because you need expansion skills to fill in your own niche. Like maybe you want to branch out into woodworks, different niches in plumbing or carpentry, or even designing furniture. The problem is you don't allow these people to expand their options, but also allow these people to access different masters precisely because of not only the tenure that you need, but also the soul connection that you need with these individuals. All of that's to say, these people are worse on their comparative in terms of job skills, but also worse on their comparative in terms of job welfare. All of these reasons propose.
Thank you, PM, for that speech. Calling on LO. Here.
Cuts out. We agree that these jobs are important, but we don't agree with government when they say that they want to produce these laborers and professionals through formal credentialing. So let's frame things really quickly, right? So what does the formal credential model actually look like? Well, 3 features to this. 1, we tell you it's inherently exclusionary, it's going to be difficult to access, and 3rd, it's going to create a lot of discrimination in the workforce and in those individuals that buy into credentialing. Therefore, on opposition, what we say instead is that it is necessary to allow these fields to be subjective, because more often than not, these jobs or these fields don't fit in a box that we can just simply standardize. So quick responses before I head on to my arguments. Note, they mentioned the harms of lack of masters in the market and the necessity for having connections or basically to be nepoed into a master apprenticeship model. Well, we tell you that these only are harms when there is no dominance of the former, when there is no dominance of the prevalence of master apprenticeships. So what happens then if we shift the world to lean into a more master apprenticeship preference or dominance in these industries, right? What happens if we have more masters and more opt-in? We tell you that we are going to get rid of scarcity because we have more masters in general. We are going to be able to get rid rid of nepotism because there's going to be a larger free market of masters to choose from. If they're complaining that there's not that many masters right now, then that already implies that the dominance instead is into formal credentialing. We don't want that. Their harms is literally based on their model. All right, first argument then. We tell you that their model, or basically focusing on formal credentialing, creates discrimination in their fields. Why? This is important, right? Because government has to defend the status quo of the dominance of formal credentialing. So what's the problem? What's happening in status quo? Note, there's a clear hierarchy of perceived value for getting formal credentialing. This looks like three things. One, the perception of trade schools being much lower than getting things in university. Let's say you want to become an electrician or you want to become a plumber. You're probably likely going to be seen as much higher or much more valued if you get this certification from universities such as the UP instead of getting it from Tesla, right? Two, note on how companies in status quo prefer degrees and certification, and the number of degrees and certification that you have probably determines your value, which means this is quite inaccessible and quite expensive. And three, note on how there's much less support for trade schools in comparison to larger universities. This means that things such as Tesla, for example, don't really have the proper infrastructures compared to a much more expensive university, right? It's more likely then that we get subsidies for things that people want to opt into instead. So probably all the money is likely to be hoarded by a state university over a trade school. Obviously, we don't want that. So the impacts of these things are quite clear. Three things. One, we're likely going to see less pay for individuals that are unable to access the top hierarchy of these formal credentialing, right? This means that if you go to Tesla, you're probably going to get lowballed in terms of your salary after you do get your certification. Two, it's likely that they're going to see much less support for individuals unable to access top-tier universities. Why? Because simply put, there's going to be less subsidy, there's going to be less support, which means that individuals wanting to get into these fields are going to have to shoulder so many more costs to pay for, certification, to pay for the exams, to pay for the materials used in these kinds of standardization tests. Obviously, we don't want that if we want the industry to be accessible. And three, we just tell you overall that less people are going to enter these industries. If it's going to cost so much but pay me so little, why the hell would I even bother entering these kinds of things? And we tell you that this is quite harmful because we need these jobs, especially technical blue collar workers, right? When we see a plummeting rate of people becoming plumbers, right, or plummeting rate of people becoming electricians, right? Obviously, that's a really bad thing because we need these individuals to sustain society. But if we continue to push a narrative that universities are better than trade schools are better than master apprenticeships, it's unlikely then that you're going to get individuals that are going to continue opting into this field. We tell you that's really harmful. We're just limiting the number of people that we can choose from. So the conclusion to this argument is very simple. We tell you it's harmful to further push discrimination or inequality narratives in our society. We tell you that on our side, students are going to have greater fulfillment of learning because they have more autonomy and because of the inherent attention that they will get from master apprenticeship models, right? Instead of a standardized test where you're probably in a classroom with 50 other people. And the second argument, very clear. We tell you that there are so many benefits to master apprenticeship, which are going to be much more magnified when we create the dominance of such in our world. So why is this important, right? Three things. One, we tell you that we're going to reduce harms and protect workers in our world. So in this House Prefers motion, our world has a lot of masters to choose from because it's the dominant narrative or it's a dominant reality. This means that if I was an artist and I wanted to specialize in something like body art or brutalism, so on and so forth, I could pick a master that fits into my niche, right? In comparison, on their side, they're probably going to have to take a more generalized class where the teachers probably expect them to fit into the general niche, which probably will impede upon their own self, their own individualism and their own self-actualization in their own fields. We don't want that. And two, we tell you that in our world, when our narrative is more dominant, people can become masters down the line, and people are more encouraged rather to become masters down the line. Note on how there's going to be a culture of rendering back service to the industry that nurtured you. Why is that important, or why is that likely? Note, because in our world, because there's an abundance of masters, right? There's not going going to be a discrimination of looking down upon people that become masters or become apprentices to masters. This means that on their world, when people look down on masters, people are less likely to become apprentices, right, or masters in general. In our world, because that's the abundant narrative, people are more likely to buy into this system, and this means people can further push into their own niches. And third, we tell you that because this model is more hands-on compared to a standardized classroom, it's going to be much more conducive for the learning, especially for individuals that learn by doing, right? When we talk about these fields aren't simple sciences, right? It's more likely that these fields need a lot of hands-on application for these people in these industries to learn. This means that when we have these individuals operate in an environment where they can actually do the job they want to do in the future, we tell you their learning is just going to be so much more better. So what's the benefits of this, right? We tell you on our side, we have the autonomy of choice versus their side where they have to stick to standardization. Our side, students are allowed to learn what they want to. On their side, students are forced to learn what they don't want to. They probably waste time, money, and resources in going to a niche that they don't want. So proud to oppose.
Thank you, Ella, for that speech. Calling on DPM. Here.
All right, just PM me in the chat, please. Not sure why it's not turning on. Oh yeah. Okay. So all right. Recording my speech as well. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Firstly, I will deal with the cost push that they have. There are a variety of reasons why cost is better under our side. First, I will explain why cost is not inherently lower on theirs. Note the reality that you have to do on their side. It is likely that you are stuck in informal labor for a long period of time that you are likely unpaid or underpaid for. This is the reality that in many places in the Philippines under our world. It is far worse if they say the dominance, because note, if it's a variety of multiple different masters, and each master then has the ability to say, I don't want to teach you the maximum things that I want to teach you, because likely you are then going to leave me for another master or other things, which is why they want to keep you dependent, which is why they want to keep you within these informal circles. It's unclear why then the cost or the length of time that they will spend in the training process then will be much lower. It'll likely be much longer. That increases the cost in which, and opportunity cost in which these people have to provide for their own lodging. These people have to be underpaid for a long period of time, compared to our side where it's likely 2 to 3 years of structured formal learning that is likely far lower in the cost of actual life years that you have that you could be working. Secondly, we explain a variety of reasons why costs are in fact lower under our side, even if you assume a dominance under theirs, because we also have a dominance. 3 reasons. 1, it is far easier to subsidize on the national scale, especially if you have things like schools, campuses, etc. You cannot subsidize informal networks that by nature are reliant on trust and by nature are reliant on being in closed spaces. It's unclear how the government can intervene there. Versus our side, it's easier for TESTA to set up vocational schools. Note in the US, trade schools are free, by the way. They subsidize these things. In Kenya, they massively subsidize trade schools because they know it's a very, very large source of employment for a lot of people. It's easier to do that if you have the massive visibility of these campuses and the ability for you to concentrate that funding in the most effective way. 2, it is far easier to resource pool in training such that the cost for individual learners is lower. On a master apprenticeship level, you are likely 2 to 3 apprentices to a master. That means that you likely have to bear a lot of the cost for your individual, like paint, like resources, electronic kits, etc. Under our side, it's 40 students in a classroom, which means that you can resource pool to lower the individual cost of each learner because you can share resources. You can share it across the campus. You can share it across a classroom. In their side of the house, there's often a lot of this wastage because you have to teach individually small number and group of people, which is why they often have to spend more. 3, we have shorter periods we are underpaid or unpaid because even if you go through education, guys, we have a structured process of learning and a clear path to certification, which just means after 2 to 3 years, you are guaranteed to get out and to work. On their side of the house, it's unclear when the timeline is, but it's likely much longer because they want to keep you there longer, which just means that the opportunity cost that we are foregoing for the amount of time that we can work is just less. So if they want to talk about cost, we've won on cost. But if you have to believe on their side that cost, even in our worst case, is much like it's marginally better on theirs, you have to weigh on two things. One, on protections. In the worst case on their side, they are likely to be exploited in these worst cases or underpaid or significantly manipulated by these masters because they have to be loyal. They have to be indebted, as what Enzo says in the previous speech, to their master and not go into a different place and earn more. That is the protections that we have under our side. You have structured process of learning. You can appeal if you are, for example, rejected by your curriculum or you're rejected by your company. You can have, for example, a certification that says you actually were taught in a particular area. On their side, if your master doesn't like you, they can just tell to their friends, I don't like this person anymore. And then they don't ever get employed or they don't ever get proper certification, for example, or ever get accepted. That's a harmful thing. In the worst case, where a large number of these people are indeed so present, it's more likely that the cases of exploitation are larger. Two, you have to weigh on terms of long-term resilience. Perhaps the short-term cost is higher, but the long-term, they are capped by how prestigious their master is or the opportunities that their master provides them. Under our side of the house, you are capped by the certification that you get, which is likely more meritocratic and more recognized, which is why you're more able to lateral between different companies, have better opportunities, and all of that. So on weighing on not only on protections, but also in terms of the long term, we already win on cost. Secondly, I will deal with this cheese on, well, there's a difference in dominance on their side. I will explain why dominance is terrible on theirs. One, an abundance of masters does not mean significantly more options. They say this from Enzo. You can now go to multiple different masters. This is not true for a few reasons. One, no, there's always a problem of scale. For you to have this sort of hands-on teaching, by nature, guys, even if there's so many masters, or it's still like 1-to-1 or 1-to-2 or 1-to-3, that is not the actual need of billions of people, especially in developing countries, that do need the ability to access online school, that do need the ability to access scalable schools that are actually able to teach a variety of different people rather than the informal systems. If they want to dilute the process and say, well, no, we're going to have so many masters, then that dilutes the quality point that they have. Because there's so many masters, it's unclear how you can get quality on their side of the house. Two, it is also unclear how you can move between different masters. Like, if they want to say loyalty, guys, your master will not want you to move to a different master by the nature of loyalty. But also, a master would prefer to train someone from scratch because they know they're teaching them the exact same techniques that they want them to learn. It's unclear what they would accept if we wanted to go to a different master, especially on their side. If there are so many different masters, there's an increased incentive for each individual master to keep their secrets, to keep it so they don't leak out different people because there's more competition between them. So it's unclear why they would accept so many people and in fact be so accepting on your side. It's more likely they are more exclusive by the nature of the fact that they have so many more people that are competing to on their side. Compare this to the dominance under our side, which is likely to scale better in the long term. Before I explain why they scale better in the long term, PY. Okay, so why does the dominance of the R side scale better in the long term? Firstly, if there's more people that are thinking about improving curriculums get better in quality. They say these things are not good under our side. It's unclear why. Like, if there's multiple people that want the best possible trade school, especially if you're competing with other trade schools, the quality of education that you have, the quality of like the credential certification you are giving is more likely to be better than our side of the house. Whereas their side, if there's more masters, that incentivizes them to be more secretive, more likely not adapting to the times, for example, or to be generally accepting of new knowledge because they want to keep their own particular secrets. So the quality of people that we have under our side is greater. Two, if you don't believe a dominance is necessary for equality, you need to believe that a dominance is necessary for minimum standards. They say there's not likely going to be standardized. It's impossible to standardize. Like, if standardization and the higher upper crust skill is not the most important thing, the most important thing you have to defend then, or you have to like, default to, is minimum standards of competence, of safety, of compliance. And this is important because especially if you have online courses on either side of the house or more like diversified, globalized systems of education and working on either side of the house, you need people to say as an employer, this person is reliable, this person we can trust. That's what happens more under our side. On their side of the house, again, you are limited by a geographic circle that you have no matter which dominance model that you have to defend on or cheese on from the next deputy speaker. It's unlikely that will massively get better in the long term, which is why in a comparison of dominance, in a comparison of cost, in a comparison of success and access, we clearly win.
Thank you, DPM, for that speech. Calling on Yellow. Here.
Hello. I guess I will stand up as well. Gov says that we have nepotism, abuse, and restricted people. This is untrue, and I think they have very little proof for this. The first thing to note is that all of these harms only exist because there is no dominance. That is, when there are only 10 masters that you could choose from, and you have to actively rely on your connections to get these masters. But I want to specifically be clear on what changes in our world because they don't really engage with this. When there's a dominance, the world prioritizes the creation of masters. It subsidizes the variety of ways that you could become a painter, a sculptor, a chef, an electrician, or what have you. This is important because if there is no scarcity of masters, it creates a wider and wider pool of masters. And this is particularly good because now it takes off the ability for masters to gatekeep the way that they teach their apprentices because they know that many masters will come after you. And therefore, the only legacy that you have to cement is not you specifically as one master, but rather the legacy of the specific art form, the specific culinary style that you have to provide. That's why under our side of the house, I think it's quite absurd for the previous speaker to explain that many masters will just want to gatekeep their people when in fact that is untrue when the dominance happens. So if they say that sticky wages exist, that there are poor workers who are unpaid and underpaid, we say this is untrue because more masters and many masters mean that there are more brutalist specialists or dessert specialists. So you can leave one master for another if you are paid really bad or abused. They talk about poor resources. We think this is also untrue because under our side, we can share resources because apprentices choose masters with niches and cultural ties. Talk about communities like Apuang Od who have unique cultural ties with their community. You could share resources within these communities as well. And so under our side, you are not capped by how prestigious the master is, as the previous speaker says, because you can always go to different masters. There is no incentive for masters to gatekeep and be exclusive. Number one, because literally involuntary servitude laws exist. So you cannot be forced to stay in there, right? But secondly, you as a student have the incentive to gather as much in knowledge as much as possible with how you could express yourself the best. And that is why most people who go to Juilliard, for example, or that famous French school that's partnered with Ateneo in France, for example, have many different tutors or people that you could learn from. You are not restricted to one master, for example. And so I don't think a lot of their harms exist. And I don't think that nepotism, abuse, and restriction exists because we don't have to get tenured for you to self-actualize. You could jump from many different firms, and that only exists when the dominance exists. The first thing I'll talk about is why practical tests and the things they try to co-opt on Gov are significantly worse. So note that they say, you can still have practical experiences and all of these things. I want to note that these are significantly worse. The first reason is because class sizes are typically large, but people have different artistic styles and culinary styles. This is a problem because usually when you create standardized curriculums and practical exams, there are usually one instructor who judges the practical tests unilaterally. This is bad because instructors are typically attuned to one artistic or culinary style. That is, they have implicit bias. Or either their institution is typically more Western or European, where European and Western styles are considered the gold standard and by which curriculums are standardized. This is worse off because you are quite literally making a subjective field more objective. And this is a problem because in non-academic fields, there is no one way for you to be good. And you can be good in many ways. So under their side, people flunk non-academic fields even when there's no basis to do so. Or less non-academics go around because it's exclusionary and people are discouraged from pursuing these. So they don't get their benefits. Under our side of the house, when there is multiple masters and many, many different students all around the world, there is no more incentive to be like this. It's a more free-form environment where you are allowed to fail so you can improve. Under their side, they try to discredit the ability for you to fail. When you fail, you literally have to retake multiple times and by a standard that is not necessarily correct. But under our side as well, there's more centrality to who you want to be as a non-artistic person. To the masters and apprentices who are taught specifically on local and regional cultures that are more attuned to their identities. That is exclusive under our side of the house because you don't generalize this pool of students. The third thing I'm going to talk about is that the dominance of this on government creates hierarchies for what institutions are better. This is why under their side, universities, which are expensive and subject people to insane student debt, are seen as the gold standard. And if you go to trade schools and certification bodies, you will you'll be viewed as fundamentally lesser. The first thing to note is that government explains that more credentials is equal better and that we can subsidize trade schools. This is still worse under their side because the value of the credentials you get are fundamentally diluted because you went to TESDA versus if you went to Juilliard for art school, for example, and you learned all of these things and you're significantly seen as better. So under their side, you now incentivize people to opt to get the best form of credentials. And this is bad because where do you get the best form of credentials? It is in the best universities, usually private institutions that have really high paywalls or really high tuition for you to get the benefits that you get under their side of the house. Less fortunate people go to the non-big four schools, go to TESDA, go to certification bodies, and because of the dominance of this, you now create a big pool of people where, yes, we concede, maybe you do get access under their side, but inequality massively widens because they have less pay if you go to trade schools or certification bodies, and you are locked into the very same institutions that they claim you get locked into under our side of the house. At the very least, under our side of the house, you don't have to worry about these things because you personally go get to work in the different communities that you choose when you have different masters. And under this side, there's less incentive for you to get exploited, and there's less incentive for you to get screwed over because of wages, because precisely because these fields are subjective. These fields don't have one objective form of art or culinary which like you want to fight for under their side of the house. And these things therefore don't create a hierarchy by which this form of art or culinary style is better than this form of art, but it also creates a larger impact overall because now it creates less inequality between the humanities and art fields as opposed to STEM fields, because under our side of the house, the vast variety of it now creates less like disparities in terms of wages. So I don't think they get their benefits as well. This debate is not just about where we get meritocracy, because under their side, meritocracy is worse. Wealthy students can afford to pay for private tutors. Wealthy parents with strong interests can manipulate exceptions for students. Wealthy students can significantly get better opportunities and still get the same harms that they explain under our side. But the difference is when you have master apprentices, this is when you get the vast majority of benefits because now you bridge the gap between what you learn in school and what you apply, because you keep learning by doing under our side of the house. But also you get significantly more autonomy and you are not locked into the same extent under their side when you have to go 4 years to go to a particular school and you're not even sure if you're going to graduate.
Thank you, Dialog. At speech, calling on Go Up Whip. Here.
Is it fine? Can you hear me well?
Your voice is a bit soft. I'll just increase my volume if
Okay,
ever.
I can also speak louder. Don't worry. Okay, hold on. I'll take PYs through the chat, please. I want to start my speech by explaining what the dominance of formal credentials is and how it impacts the world in 3 ways. The first thing is the ability for you to attract students. On government side, you attract them by having a best curriculum or, for example, keeping costs of tuition low and other fees low. Second is, on opposition, what happens is it depends on the personal CV of the master. There are 2 implications our case draws from this. 1, there's less teachability, especially, for example, that master still has to focus on professional development in order to get more students. Probably means they care less about teaching, oftentimes, for example, their apprentices. They have less time for it, etc. The second thing is they will not teach you a variety of skills because they already have a specialty, so they're just unlikely to give you the holistic amount of development that we say students need. Second way I explain is how they compete. On government side, the way they compete is, for example, lower cost, but also employment rates after graduation. On opposition, it is often they bypass a lot of this competition by having non-competes. And this is important. Their masters are still employed by companies. So that means that the companies will often require that this master, for example, is the feeder for a lot more new, for example, engineers or new plumbers to enter this particular company. This is why it's particularly pernicious. But the third thing is I want to explain the trickle down because I think it implicitly replies to the previous speaker quite a lot. The first thing is you have investment for multiple fields, and that's why technological vocational schools, for example, are incredibly low cost. So you don't just have investment, for example, plumbing specialists or plumbing companies. You also have investment, for example, architecture, for example, carpentry, which often means that the costs are incredibly spread across a variety and a huge amount of student body, which means that it's likely to be affordable. But the second thing is you take the curriculum from other universities, and that's not often accessible. So, for example, no developing countries can take the curriculums, for example, elite universities abroad, but they can apply their own nuance, which is sponsored the previous speaker. But secondly, obviously means that these are not as expensive as with opposition stream. The first thing I want to deal with is near field access. One is on cost. The first thing I want to deal with is that it gets increasingly cheaper, primarily because there is competition between one other technical vocational schools, which more and more people will opt into because it's a dominance, which is that you have to actively compete on curriculum and price. Secondly, you cater to lower income clientele anyway. So if you're competing and telling people that this is the best way to get a job outside of a university, so obviously you won't place them in the same amount of debt as universities would place them, etc. So it's still a comparative advantage. Weigh that against nepotism, which often relies on some form of connection that people cannot meritocratically get. So, for example, from a low-income individual, at least you can excel and study really hard in your subjects, as opposed to, for example, you being in the right place in the right time to actually meet with master. Second thing I want to deal with is scarcity. Their counter argument is that this dominance means that there's going to be more masters. There are two inherent problems that this thing does not solve. First is, you are still limited by things like geography, which means that if the master is very, very far away from you, or for example, there's no master in this particular area, I'm not sure what you expect people to do, as opposed to just opt into a broad technological vocational school, which already probably has a curriculum or the different amount of classes they want to teach. But secondly, if this is true, the value of each master is diluted, because if there's so many masters, then presumably you trust the word of mouth of each individual master less, which is that you don't get the job security that they talk about. There are three ways I'd like to respond to this, however. One, this is still likely to be significantly limited for a couple of reasons. First, there are less students being taught at a time because of personal demands. So you have to teach them all subjects, you have to teach them constantly, you have to be the OJT, etc. So you just individually, even as a master, cannot get as many students. Secondly, it takes a long time for you to be a master. There are limited opportunities within corporations for you to be promoted. Career progression typically takes 30 to 40 years, as opposed, for example, to our side, where people can actually learn this in school, maybe take a higher degree for it, and then eventually become teachers. So the progression is a lot shorter and a lot clearer. Secondly, masters will enforce a non-compete because they want to benefit their company. And this is what this team does not want to respond to. They obviously do not want to lose out to competition if what they say is true, you have so many masters and so many demands. But secondly, this is the only solvent thing on their side. You become masters down the line because of the trend of, for example, loyalty. One, this is terrible because oftentimes you'll focus on your own traditional form of style being passed, especially when competition is incredibly high. You're incredibly scared, for example, that your student won't follow the same forms of architecture as you did, and therefore you lose your personal branding. So there's an incentive to actually limit what they learn and focus only on what you think is traditional or what you think is secure. But secondly, because it's loyalty based, what that means is that if you leave, for example, a master, that master can go around and tell other masters that, for example, you are unloyal, you will backstab them, you will never stay with that company, even the amount of personal investment that you have, which means that individuals still cannot access the optionality that this team wants. An optionality. You need to wait for the master to approach you under their side versus applying to a variety of college and opportunities. What are the two implications of this? One, that's where you get more exploitative deals because you cannot weigh against a lot of options. If any master approaches you, especially because you know that's a very rare opportunity, you will take it and you will not demand for more. As opposed to, for example, the same exam or application period of 4 months that you can apply to a variety of different learning educational institutions, which is that you're still better off. The second thing is the leverage, right? Because it's informal, it's opaque, it is up to the discretion, and oftentimes you are just a newbie in this industry. As opposed to, for example, student contracts, which are oftentimes legally binding, and by the way, have a lot of educational types of restrictions on them because they know how important it is to students, which is mandated by the vast majority of governments, even developing governments. Before I win on worker welfare and quality, is there a POI? 3, 2, 1.
Yeah, wait. Yeah, no. Oh, yeah. So I don't understand why you have to be limited by geography when clearly people can take masters that are most proximate to their culture, religion, or what have you, as I explained.
So if you're, for example, a lower income individual, why would there be, for example, plumbing master in the area near you? Like, you have to answer that question. On worker welfare and quality, they first talk about attention. They have two arguments here. The first argument is that there are generalized classes which are likely to be bad. One, obviously these classes will still be specialized. And what often happens is that there's a general education period and there's a specialized education period. So for example, in technological vocational schools, the first year is often more generalized, but the second becomes far more specialized. But the second thing is that even if this is true, it is not a bad thing that classes are general. Because one, it's still likely to be good quality because of things like competition. But secondly, you don't know the niche that you want to enter yet. And therefore, more holistic or general knowledge of the different types of areas in this particular industry might be good for you, especially if you don't want to commit to one and, for example, later regret it down the line when you realize it's not for you. Second thing they say is you have hands-on classes and application. Crucially, as we already modeled out from first speaker, on-the-job training can exist on both sides. But why is it better under our side? First, there are multiple companies. You can choose which OJT in the terms and conditions that you like the most. But secondly, you can easily switch if you don't like it, because the norm is that it's just any form of employment. So obviously, for example, after 2 to 3 years, if you realize it's not for you, you can switch, as opposed to the incredibly loyalty-based system that they have, which often demonizes you from switching and primarily limits your opportunities. The second thing I want to talk about then at second speaker is the instructor bias. One, you have multiple teachers in a university or even in a school. Secondly, there are still objective metrics that I think are valuable. So for example, maybe art is subjective, but in order for you to, for example, make the best painting you can, you need a general knowledge on things like color theory or shapes, for example, which means that there are still objective metrics that often mean that you can make your work better and more competitive. But the more important thing is that you will be taught by different specialists. You will learn proficiency in multiple skills, as opposed to one master, which is like the one craft or one specialty. That means that you can only maximize that particular skill instead of variety. For those reasons, propose.
Thank you, Coffee, for that speech. Calling on opposition whip.
I have to stand up like everyone else. How do I do this? Okay. Sorry, I don't know how to use them. I'll start now. Forcing non-academic fields into boxes is something that is abhorrent and also reduces the fulfillment and the entry towards these types of fields. The first thing I want to respond to is the previous speaker. They say that most often than not, the way that you attract a lot of these students is you to lower down your tuition fee and make your curriculum more attractive. Understand that this is just generally patently untrue. Culinary school is inherently expensive. In order for you to be the best chef, in order for you to be part of the competitive field, in order for you to enter arts and the artistic field, most often than not, you have to come from a very privileged background. And even things like being an appliance maintenance individual, you have to enter things like mechanical engineering that is inherently more expensive. And they cannot necessarily rely on scholarships and subsidies, because most often than not, this is often scarce and also don't necessarily provide you the inherent type of learning that most students require. Understand that if masters have connections towards things and towards companies and professional background, right, like Riva analyzes, that's inherently good. If they also vie for things like OJT, that means that our world is just a bunch of OJTs that you're probably going to have. And that's generally significantly better, because given the fact that number one, your employment is already secured, given the fact that you already have a connection within a company and a master that will probably want you to enter, and understand that we have multiplicities of masters, given the fact that this is a now institutionalized and a more dominant way of us learning for non-academic fields. And but also at the same time, you have experiential learning that you can take towards different types of company that gains you greater amount of greater amount of choices in the future. This is just generally better. Understand that the whole what if there's no masters in your area is something that is just simply absurd in this debate, because that means that it's not inherently a dominance then. Understand that if this is an institutionalized norm that we have as of today, most often than not, you will find a master in your area, given the fact that even Zen himself said that these jobs are inherently more important and therefore there's a general demand for them. That means that our form of competition is just generally more better, given the fact that most often than not, if you are competing with other masters, that means that you want to impart a legacy that you were a good teacher, that you were a good masters to train under, and therefore gain momentum and gain more students in the future. I don't understand why they are just simply not necessarily generous in this debate, that the competition that they have is inherently good, but all the forms of competition on our side suddenly breeds bad incentive structures, when most often than not, good incentive structures are born from this type of dominance versus institutions that create massive amounts of inequality, given the fact that we see you as a lower value individual if you are from a trade school, if you only have certification, and therefore the investment requirement for each student become higher on their side of the house. The second thing I want to explain in this debate is this whole nepotism argument, which by the way is already dead by Desher's speech. Understand that it's just patently untrue. Note that this is a result of the dominance of credential modeling, that as a default, you have to go to a university and also get certification. What does that mean? Number one, there's lesser masters in their world, and therefore the premium exists. On our side, if everyone else is also a masters themselves, even if they are not the most prestigious individual, at least they can give and impart technical knowledge and application towards those types of individuals. Premium is only the premium, and the idea that there's only a few individuals that will become masters. It is most often than not happens on their side of the house, where only the elite are the people that do this. Like, for example, in the culinary world, where masters are only a select number of individuals, and the rest of the school must pay for expensive culinary schools because one, there's lesser incentive for you to enter towards like an apprenticeship system, or second, on our world, there's a system of master apprenticeship that people are generally going to enter into that they don't necessarily want to engage with. Note, Enzo explains that in a world where the norm is an apprentice-based system, there's less barriers for you to become a master's, and therefore there's a free market of them. Right now, we see a decrease in entering blue-collar work, like LO explains. That's because of the inherent discrimination that is founded within this type of system. Most often than not, university degree is a requirement on top of you getting an OJT, and on top of you also getting additional certification to get tangible experience and to find lucrative job in these types of spaces, because we are so credentially focused in the world where it's inherently pernicious. I'll take that POI.
So even if inequality exists under our side, as we explain, increased access naturally corrects it. But you have no comparative analysis as to why hierarchies of, for example, more skilled or clouty masters will be fixed.
So that's the thing. We can also have clouty masters, but that means there's a general pool of other masters that might not necessarily be cloud based, but at least you have experiential experiences in the kitchen. You have experience within the company that has things like mechanical engineering. You have the capacity to go to art galleries that are tangible experiences. Versus on your end, they have to pay for things like tuition fee, which are already high. Two, they have to pay for their own supplies and things like trade school in developing nations, especially in places like the Philippines and Kenya, that make it harder for them to graduate and get the ROI that they deserve. The third thing is that if you also buy for things like OJT, it is also often unpaid, and you also have to work in confined spaces and one-on-one interaction, and therefore the whole loyalty argument, which by the way we never relied on and even explained on our side of the base, because if there's a multiplicity of masters, there is no expectation of loyalty. Given the fact that you have multiple masters, you can shift from one master to another, but also at the same time, that means that if you are buying for things like OJT that also has things like apprenticeship system, that means all of your harms also exist on your side of the house, but 10 times more, because given the fact that this is an invisible industry that we cannot necessarily regulate. Versus on our side, the dominance is better because there's more masters. And come on guys, if the masters is inherently horrible, and then you tell other students that they're a horrible master and ruin their image, at least there's now an incentive structure for other masters to also do better in their field and become better teachers over time. We would suggest that it's just simply bad on their side, when most of the time people who are outliers from the credential model because they cannot access it towards things like cost or even things like geographical like difficulties, we would suggest that the model itself is just generally bad, that you have more experience of poor masters, abusive masters. That's why Enzo argued in his speech on things like autonomy, and also that should argue for the multiplicity of masters that you have on our side of the house. I think that the conclusion of this is just generally bad for students who are not necessarily good for theoretical classroom learning or generic learning that is not necessarily enough for them, that increases the investment requirement for the students in order for them to compete, versus an apprenticeship where you can focus on getting real world experience. Even if they're not necessarily the most clouty individual, at least you can put something in your CV that you did work for a company, that you did work for an art gallery, that you did work in movie production, given the fact that you had a master that gave you these types of teaching. We would suggest that application-based learners that don't necessarily thrive in graded and test-based education are the people that they harm on their side of the house, that we gain no response from coming from any of their speakers.
Thank you, Op, for that speech. Calling on Op reply to end the Op case.
Hello. Oh. Please hold on. Okay. Many things were said in this debate, but I just want to ask one question, Francis. If you have non-academic fields, more artistic-leaning fields, and more subjective-leaning fields where there's no one way to be good, and you could be good in many, many ways, why would you want to standardize the curricula? Why would you want to give them written exams about color theory or how shapes work when something like art, something like food, are things that you could literally excel at and be very good at, even if you didn't have 4 years of education in a university? The thing is, that's what government fails to answer. Because even if costs are lower on their side, they don't explain why a trade school is as competitive as the rich kids who go to uni. In fact, they don't become more meritocratic. I said in my speech earlier, wealthy students can pay for private tutors to pass. Wealthy parents can manipulate exceptions for students. So in fact, nepotism and abuse, which is their main harm, actually happens on their side because you focus so much on credentials, and we don't get a convincing response from Riva in her speech as to why the dominance of universities will not happen, right? Because even if they subsidize the cost of trade schools, guess what? You're going to create a lot of graduates from TESTA. But I'm not sure why the graduates of TESTA that you create on their side are fundamentally more competitive, are fundamentally paid better under their side. And this is where the absurdity of government comes in. Because even if you have 4 years or 2 to 4 years in whatever institution you have under their side, the value of the credentials you get are significantly diluted. You have so much supply of credentials that when you apply and show these to a person, to an employer, they're like, yeah, but everybody else has credentials. And I don't understand why they get their benefits then. Riva asked the question to Kim. So how do we then remove the hierarchies? Well, that's the point, right? Because under our side, we said because these are such subjective fields, it doesn't matter which master you go to as long as it's in the field that or niche that you personally want to achieve in or you want to learn a lot in, because there is no one art style or culinary style that is fundamentally better than the rest. And that's what we actively remove under our side. We are telling the entire world, because there is such a dominance, that all of these people, all of these art styles, all of these culinary styles are very, very good things, and that you should focus on the things that you will get self-expression in. And that is fundamentally good, because under their side, they get stuck in school that's so devolved from industry. What you learn in color theory, you won't give a crap about when you are employed. But under our side, the constant OJTs, the constant experiential learning, that is what creates better artists and better non-academicians, not just in terms of jobs, because you're pretty much assured jobs in whatever master you go to, but also in terms of self-fulfillment, which is a huge part of the debate that they don't engage with. All they want to talk about are very academic things like sticky wages, even if we told you that we don't get sticky wages under our side and we won't get locked into tenure, or we won't get as low, like unpaid and poor resources as they explain. They actively talk about, like, they try to fear monger and explain that a lot of things are wrong under their side. But you have to look at your notes. You have to look at the analysis they specifically gave as to why formal credential-based schooling is fundamentally better. And if you look at it, all it revolves around is the issue of cost. But again, this debate is not just about cost, because as I explained in my speech, it is not about cost only. It is that even if you gain access under their side, you vastly widen the inequality. And that's where the debate lied, which Riva did not respond to in their speech. So at the end of this debate, why are we clearly winning the round versus this other team? It is because no matter how many structural reasons they provide, the question of the debate is not one of where we get more access, but rather where we get the vast majority of self-fulfillment for people who don't want to be academicians, for artists, for chefs. And that's where we get it better, because I explained in my speech, practical tests are worse under their side because of instructors that don't care about them, but also because universities will still have a hierarchy as opposed to the trade schools that they want to fight for.
Thank you, Upper Reply, for that speech. Calling on Gov Reply. Here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, my mom was just going out there. Okay. I'll start my speech in 3, 2. Francis and Saksham, this speech will show you why the trade of taking POIs is important. The first response is, I don't know, man, color theory seems pretty important for an art student. But let's go on to the real issues. Firstly, on access. They say certifications, exams, and getting a diploma and degree are incredibly expensive. They lived maybe 100 years ago, because maybe that was true back then. But recently, we've seen an insane push towards access because of competition. It is state-funded trade schools, online tutorials, and courses, which comparatively have the incentive to build on upscaling opt-in because they have resources like cutting and carpentry machinery, art and electrician teachers who can handle multiple classes with set schedules, even things like pooled funding that Jello explains to you to little to no response from them, which is especially important for people opting into trade schools and expanding the inequality or like lessening the inequality that exists that they explain as a harm. But secondly, it might be financially cheaper, we agree, but the long-term costs are massive that they have no response to. It is sticky labor mobility that lock you into one job and one company that weakens your capacity to negotiate wages or promotions. Exploitation that similarly results from inert labor movement, or even skills in what you want to learn, to choose what to specialize in, to choose to opt out of a bad master, like Terra profs who are also there probably bad Terra masters that are impossible for you to opt out of because of the reasons we explained. Their response is to say, well, the dominance has so much masters, and so our harms don't manifest. Maybe this is true. We will charitably engage and weigh this. Firstly, this does not engage with the culture of master apprentice models, i.e., you are locked there for years. You have heavy competition between masters, which, if you believe they're comparative of a lot of masters, is more likely. But secondly, that loyalty-based culture to get benefits of job connections are important because that's what you need to be able to get nepoed in. Secondly, this still continues, therefore, things like nepotism and doesn't remove. You force companies to keep masters and apprentices in their competitive. Exploitation exponentially grows. The response to this is to say, but schools have hierarchies. The problem is that there are still masters and hierarchies are symmetric in good and bad masters. The difference is the extent of nepotism and lack of meritocracy that they have no response to, other than there's a bunch of masters and this doesn't exist. But thirdly, it's the importance of schools and credentials that is standardization. Jello explains it's the floor that you have to maintain a standard for. In fact, they say you learn from a bunch of masters. You'll rotate around the world. You go to Juilliard, which I want to note is a French cooking school, which sounds like exactly a school setup, right? Which is probably just as, if not more expensive without subsidies. The way you should weigh this then on access is what can the average person actually be able to access? Is it the geographical limits of a master, some random bumfuck guy who knows how to strip wires for copper? Or at the very least, a state-funded school that is able to assure you credentials, that is able to assure you standardization and access to multiple different companies versus being nepoed into one place, being exploited and beaten again and again. Lastly, on protections. If anything, there's no response to this. This is the most important argument. We explained to you why standardizing credentials are important. What they do is create transparency across job markets that are otherwise extremely opaque. How are you able to do things like negotiate wages? How are you able to do things like compare the work that you do and the abuses that happen? The problem is you never had the option to opt out, and that by effect means the protections of people not only within the master-apprentice relationship, but also outside of it within work is heavily lessened. Secondly, what this does is create standards against abuse that are regulatable. Like the question that remains on their side to no response is, if it's one guy, you rely on all of these apprentices filing a case, which if you believe these people aren't financially expensive, is hard. Schools and online certifications, on the other hand, allow for better choice and opt-out and accountability by just firing people. That baseline ability for you to hold people accountable, to be able to send them out of these schools, to be able to not opt into them, is massively important, especially for the most vulnerable people when they never had options from the moment they were born. But lastly, it's that transferability and mobility were important for people. The comparative they had to engage with was how people deal with an unfair, self-interested world, to which their response is to abandon them and to leave them to the dogs. Clearly, this is not a world you support. It's a world where people are exploited, where people cannot access a variety of different jobs, where people themselves are kept under the same system of nepotism, the same system of corruption, with no ability to opt out. All these reasons propose.
Thank you, Governor, for that speech. Debaters, even across the House. Saksham, let's go to the Discord